Hi, and today we're going to continue our series on the Beatitudes, Jesus' top tips on ways to live. If you've missed the other talks in this series, and I would encourage you to listen to them, especially the talk that I gave just a few weeks ago, the introductory talk. In that talk I explained that the Beatitudes are godly ways of living that we're called to cultivate so as to receive God's blessing to us and also to pass it on to a needy world. And when we look at the Beatitudes, it's best not to think of them as guidelines to ensure that we are really good. Instead, it's best to see them as guidelines that draw us close to God and be reflections and reflectors of Him. You know, Christian discipleship it's not focused on being good, it's focused on being God's. Being good just comes as the natural consequence of knowing God's goodness over us. And so today I want to look at another one of the Beatitudes, and you'll find that in Matthew 5:5. And it says this: "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Before we go on any further, let's just pray and ask God to be with us. Lord, as we just listen to this talk, I just pray that this would be more than just a great lecture. This would be a time when we hear your voice in us and we're compelled to make great changes in our lives. Be with us now, Lord. May this be a time when we really connect well with you. Amen. And so in this beatitude, the word meek, it can mean humble. I wonder whether, when you hear that word meek, what do you think? Does it have positive or negative connotations? I think sometimes when we might regard the meek to be a bit wimpy or a bit weak, maybe a bit passive or pathetic. Well, I want to show you that meekness is not a synonym for weakness. Quite the opposite. To get an idea of what meekness really means, let's have a look at Psalm 37. And verse 11 of that psalm is closely aligned with Jesus' teaching. And no doubt Jesus would have been thinking of Psalm 37:11 when he talked about this beatitude. In the psalm it says, "And the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant prosperity." And I want to run through the context of this passage because I think it will really help us to understand what constitutes meekness or humility. So we could divide Psalm 37 into two chunks with verse 11 separated into two. So the first chunk, verses 1 to 11, in that what we read is a series of steps that lead towards meekness. And in the second chunk, the psalmist talks about people who he calls them wicked. These are people who deliberately choose not to follow God or his ways. And for the next bit of the talk, I just want for us to look at the steps that lead towards meekness in verses 1 to 11 of Psalm 37. So let's start with verses 1 and 2. It says, "Do not fret because those who are evil," do not fret because of those who are evil, or be envious of those who do wrong. For like the grass they will soon wither, and like green plants they will soon die away. It says don't fret. In other words, don't worry about those when they seem like they're winning in society and they're sort of pushing everyone down around them. It says, well, I don't know about you, but it seems to me that greedy and selfish people and rich and powerful people in the world, they're just becoming more rich and more powerful, and the divide between the haves and the have-nots just appears to be getting a whole lot wider. Jesus is saying, look, don't let that depress you, and don't try to be the haves to the detriment of the haves-not, because it's not going to last, is what he says. And those who rise up will fade away. God's not saying, don't worry about injustice, just let that whole stuff pass you by. No. We should definitely petition for and uphold justice. What the psalmist is really saying here is, God's goodness is bigger and stronger than any wickedness. And therefore, we just don't have to worry. And it would definitely be better for you not to get sucked into a lifestyle of greed and selfishness, because one day God is going to make all things right again. And you need to be on the right side of God when he does that. And so the psalmist then continues in verse 3. He says, "Trust the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and enjoy safe pasture." Well, we could avoid worry out of sheer obedience. We could just resist fretting because that's what God instructs us to do. But more than instruction, God offers us assistance. I don't know about you, but have you ever questioned what brings us to a position whereby we can just lay down the heaviness that worry brings? And the answer to that question is it's all to do with trusting God, that he will do what he said he will do. So if God says if he says that he'll crush people who themselves have crushed others, then that's exactly what he will do. The word trust here really means, it means to see God as trustworthy. And so people who trust in God, they do so because they believe he is trustworthy. And they don't need to fret because they take God at his word. So when he says they, referring to the wicked, will soon fade, we can just lay down our worries. We don't have to fret because Jesus has commanded that, and we know that he'll do exactly what he says he will do. And so it's not just him telling us don't worry, he's helping us not to worry because we can have faith that he's trustworthy. And people who know that God is trustworthy, they're just simply more equipped to resist worry, and they're more able to to find safety that comes with a steadfast knowledge that God keeps his promises. Let's move on to Psalm 37 verse 4 now. It says, "Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of his heart." So having been told not to fret about long-term consequences of the wrong that happens in the world, and having been given good reason for not fretting, namely that God has declared that he's going to make all things new again, and he's very trustworthy, so we can just believe him when he says that, then there's a joy that comes from trusting that God is in control and that he has our best interests in his heart. That's just fantastic news, isn't it? And then comes verses 5 and 6. They say, "Commit your way to the Lord. Trust in him and he will do this. He will make your righteousness reward shine like the dawn and your vindication like the noonday sun." The literal translation to the word commit it means roll. It means to allow the bombardment of problems and challenges that we face simply to roll off us, like water rolls off a duck's back. It's a phrase that imbues handing over to God the weight that we find hard to bear and just letting it slide off of us and onto God. And the fact of the matter is there are many people in the world who think that God's really horrible and they'll call him someone who just doesn't like people who have same-sex attraction, or God just causes loads of war in the world. And some of those people, they will just regard Christians as bigots and hypocrites, and they throw all kinds of insults at us. Truth be known, some of those insults we receive may be warranted, but not all. And here in this verse, we're reassured that God will vindicate us of the false accusations that we get, and he will issue to us justice. And then all this leads on to verses 5 and 6. It says, "Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Don't fret when people succeed in their ways and when they carry out their wicked schemes." Because God is our defender and our judge, we just don't need to retaliate. We can just be still. God will judge us, and only his opinion really counts. And so therefore, verse 8 continues, "Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret, it just only leads to evil." It sounds a bit similar to what we looked at in verse 1. It says, don't fret because of those who are evil, or be envious of those who do wrong. But whereas that verse, that kind of looks at us from a perspective of us being under the influence of powerful and influential people who sort of propagate injustice, this verse is saying, if you are in a powerful or influential position, if you have a standing in society, then don't misuse your position by retaliating. You know, it's even more important for people who hold positions of authority to practice humility and to refrain from an expectation that they should be served and waited upon, and that always have it their way, just because of the rank that they hold. Now, verses 9 and 10 then reiterate that God is in control over all the earth, and he commands us to lay down our natural desires to respond to situations, and he just commands us to be humble. And then we get to our key verse, verse 11. It says, but the meek will inherit the land and enjoy peace and prosperity. And what's interesting is that when we look at these steps along this journey towards meekness, what we see is that humility is both an attitude of restraint. Don't worry, don't get angry. But it's also an attitude of engagement towards God. It says, trust in the Lord, take delight in the Lord, commit your ways to the Lord, be still before the Lord. And so meekness is both an engaging attitude towards God and a restraining attitude, mostly towards others. Meekness is not wimpy or weak, it's not passive or pathetic, it's demanding and difficult. To be meek is to be like Moses, quoted in the Bible as being the most humble person ever to have lived. And he was raised up in Pharaoh's palace, but he had a sort of a compulsive anger issue. That led him to kill a guard, and he had to flee and live in a desert all alone. But there he grew to regard himself as nothing, and it was then that God later chose him to lead his people from captivity to freedom. To be meek is to be a bit like David. You see, although he had been anointed as king, he chose to suffer under a harsh rule of Saul. To be meek is to be like Paul, who despite his sort of aristocratic standing in society, he chose to present the true message that Jesus is Lord, even when it led him to imprisonment. And he chose to dampen his natural zealous personality in the courts, and rather than rise up in anger, he humbled himself before the judge. Read these books, they're just fantastic stories. You see, meekness doesn't mean we just need to be quiet or unassuming or placid. It requires us to be countercultural. Meekness requires us to stand in the face of the wicked, not just to condemn them, but to model an opposite way of life in front of them, even when we're ridiculed for doing so. Meek is not weak. But this beatitude, just like all the others, it has two parts to it. There's a way of living that we're called to cultivate, and then there's a blessing or a consequence to be enjoyed. In this beatitude, it talks about having an inheritance of all the earth. An inheritance comes as a result of someone who's died. The person who's died chooses to give that which once belonged to them to another person, and it's given to someone who they love. And so practicing humility means that we're drawn towards Jesus because, when we're drawn towards Jesus, we become like him. He is, after all, the greatest example of humility. And as we draw close to Jesus, we receive what he has to give to us. We receive his inheritance. And the current and the future gift that he has chosen to give to us, what is it? It's everything. It's peace and prosperity. It's the whole earth in all of its goodness. Now this must have sounded a bit weird, actually. When Jesus Imagine that you're there when Jesus is talking to the crowd of people gathered around him. He's there on the hillside, and he's saying, hey, it's the meek who are going to inherit the earth. That must have sounded really strange. The meek, I mean, surely it would have been people who were much more powerful than meek. They would have surely inherited the whole earth because of the power, obviously. And the Jews there, listening to Jesus, they would have thought, I just don't know, I'm not quite sure if this is true. I mean, they were under a regime, under the Roman rule. It would have seemed confusing to them to hear that to defeat the rumbostrous Romans, they would have needed to refrain from retaliating. You see, the Jews were hoping for a David-like warrior to stroll onto the scene and overthrow the centurions. For them, a mighty force was necessary to overthrow the incumbent military and political regime. But Jesus was saying the exact opposite. And you know what? Today we can testify that Jesus was absolutely correct when he said that, because the Roman Empire they're not in existence anymore. There's nowhere to be seen. They're confined to history. Well, on the other hand, followers of Jesus can be found in every country on earth. And that's really worth remembering whenever we find ourselves starting to fret or worry about how immorality is rising and there are more and more wars, and political parties are being led by individuals who appear to be very different to Jesus. And I guess actually when you think about it, humble people inheriting the earth, that's kind of a logic to this actually, because I mean, they're very attractive people. I mean, who wants to hang out with someone who isn't humble? Think of it like this. Okay, let's say you're a single person and you're looking for your future partner, and so you write down all the characteristics you want to see in this Mr. or Mrs. Wonderful that you want to spend the rest of your life with. Would you write down something like, now I want my partner to be like totally arrogant and self-seeking. I want them to lord their huge ego over me, and if you can make them a bit angry, that'd be fantastic. We don't want people like that. We want people who are humble, the opposite to all of that. We invite humble people to our party. We invite humble people around for dinner, when we're allowed to do that sort of thing. And it makes perfect sense that humble people will thrive in the world, because most people want humble people to be around them. They're just nice people. And so we could argue that the meek have already inherited the earth. We could say that the meek have already got everything that they desire because they're meek. They're content by nature, and they don't need the praise of others for their self-satisfaction. There's a story of a man who once went to a monastery just to stay there for a little while, and the monk who welcomed him and showed him to his new abode, he said, look, if there's anything you need, just let me know and I'll show you how to live without it. Meekness, it leads to contentment. As in the words of Psalm 37:11, it says that people who are meek will enjoy peace and prosperity. Because they simply believe that they have enough as a result of what Jesus has given to them. Paul puts it like this. He describes the meek as having nothing, yet having all things. Look it up, 2 Corinthians 6:10. And so we might say that the meek currently inherit the earth because they are already heirs of everything that Jesus has given to them. Paul says it like this: and if we, his children, are his heirs, then we are heirs of God and fellow heirs of Christ, sharing his inheritance with him. It comes from Romans 8:17. But this beatitude, it doesn't just talk of a current inheritance, it also talks of a future and an internal promise of inheritance. You see, the death and the resurrection of Jesus holds current, future and eternal ramifications. At some point soon, Jesus is going to return. He's going to claim what's rightfully his, and his reign will be unambiguous, and there will be no challenge to his kingship. He will be the king of the earth, and just as he is the king of the heavens. And our inheritance at that point, because we are his heirs, it will take on an eternal dynamic alongside his eternal dynamic. And so what is meekness? How does it lead to inheriting the whole earth? I'd say that the answer is most vividly seen in Jesus. Here's Philippians 2, verses 6 to 8. It says this: Jesus was like God in every way, but he did not think that his being equal to God was something to be used for his own benefit. Instead, he gave up everything, even his place with God. He accepted the role of a servant, appearing in human form. And during his life as a man, he humbled himself by being fully obedient to God, even when that caused his death. Do you know, when Jesus came to earth, he could have said, "Hi, I'm Jesus, and I'm God. Have you seen my CV? It's impressive. I can walk on water. I can raise people from the dead. I can turn water into wine, and not just rubbish stuff. I'm talking about the wine that you find on the top shelf of Waitrose. Not only am I capable, I'm also really caring. I like the poor. I am pro-gender equality. And, I almost forgot, I made the universe, and I have been around since forever, because I am the king of the kingdom of heaven." But he didn't say that. I mean, he could have done, but he didn't. Jesus now sits on the heavenly throne. He owns the earth and more besides. And he chooses to share all that he has with those who humble themselves before him and to other people as well. And the blessing of everything is given to those who stand in the face of the wicked and model an opposite way of life, who demonstrate their belief in Jesus, even when they're ridiculed for doing so. And so the message of this beatitude is the great message. And it's aimed at people who are not successful in the eyes of the world, who don't have a Daniel Craig chassis or a Barbie doll physique. This is one for people who have been humbled through not having the dream job or all the money that you might otherwise want. This blessing is for those of you who aren't at the top of the class. You know, if you've blown it, if you've not reached the standards that you know are best, and you've had to just submit and just apologize, then this blessing is for you, because you are a humble person. If your humility brings you in a position of reliance upon God, then you will inherit the earth. That's the blessing that's yours. It's heading your way. You see, what we get, our blessing, is not dependent on what we've done. It's dependent upon what he's done. Equally, I would say that this message is for those who, you might not call yourself perfect, but you've had a great track record of following God. The challenge you face is that you might just start to think that because you're doing really well, because you read your Bible every day and you wear your mask every time you go outside and you contribute more than your fair share to the food bank, if you do all that, then you kind of just ever so slightly deserve God's goodness and inheritance. Well, this message is for you too, because I'm really pleased that you're good, and that's a great thing. Carry on. But it's not your goodness that he's after. It's just you. You might have the best track record ever, but God is simply after you. And so the challenge here is for everyone. This whole thing about meekness, it really is for everyone. I want to just have a time of prayer now. Why don't we want to put all this stuff in our head now, just let it trickle down into our heart. We want this to mean something to us, don't we? So let's just pray. Let's just pray. I just want to pray now for people who have been hurt by those who are in positions of authority. Maybe a church leader, maybe me, maybe a parent, maybe a boss. I'd love for you to use this as an opportunity just to enter into a mode of just forgiving that person. Maybe you are in a position of authority. Maybe you are a parent or a boss or a manager of some form, and you know that you've not been at all times quite as fair and just and kind as you think you should be. Maybe you have some struggles with anger. Why don't you pray that God just soothes that in you? And I'd love to pray for you if you think that you've messed up life. If you know that you're not where you should be, for sure you need to sort that out, but you also need to know that God loves you regardless, and He wants to help you sort out that mess. Let's just pray now. God, we welcome you here. We welcome you into our hearts. And even if right now there's someone in our minds, they just pop up, and just as I was speaking earlier on, talking about someone who's hurt you, someone in a position of authority who's said some cruel stuff to you, not really heard you or ignored what you were saying. Why don't you just pray this prayer with me? Just, Lord, help me to forgive that person. They may have been aware of what they did, they may be unaware, but it hurt me, and I want your help to relinquish the pain. Give me your humility that I might have mercy for that person. If that's you, if that's your prayer, then just stay at this moment. Just keep on praying. Just let God speak over you now. Just listen out for His voice. If that's not you, if you're someone who is in a position of authority, and as soon as I said, maybe you've just been a bit harsh, and you've not really been that fair boss that you would love to be. You just know, oh yeah, that is so me. Why don't you join me in this other prayer now? Lord, I just want to say sorry where I've misused a position that you've so kindly given to me. And God, I want to be so humble in my position of authority. That's what I want to be known for. And so God, take all the rubbish out of my role as a boss or a manager or as a church leader or whatever it might be, even a parent, and replace it with something that's just looks like you. I want to be a reflection of you towards my kids, towards my employees, towards my congregation. And again, if that's you, just let God just give Him some time to minister to you, just to respond to that heartfelt call that you've just said. And if you're someone and you know this, you'll know it if it's you. If you've really just messed it up, if you're in a position you just think, I really shouldn't be here. I know that this isn't a great place. It might be your fault, it might not be your fault, but you just find yourself in a place and you just think, oh my goodness, how did I get here? Then then my prayer for you is just that God will He would just lift you up out of that. My prayer for you is that you wouldn't know God as someone who just whacks you, but someone who loves you regardless. For sure He wants to help you to get out of a place where you ought not to be. But in all of this, He's gonna bring you to a place of humble submission and just kneeling before Him and just saying, please God, help me. That's a great place to be. And Father God, just help that person now. Help all of us now. Again, if that's you, just carry on in that time of prayer. We just ask God that you bless you. Thanks for listening.